Have you ever felt like no one tells the truth about women anymore? Like every conversation swings between blind worship and bitter resentment, but never lands on honesty? Society tends to paint women as gentle, nurturing, morally superior beings. But what if that image is a carefully maintained illusion? And what if one of the boldest minds in philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche, saw through it all over a century ago? Nietzsche didn't hate women, but he didn't romanticize them either. While most thinkers of his time either dismissed women as irrelevant or put them on a pedestal, Nietzsche went deeper. He didn't ask what men want women to be. He asked what women are underneath all the roles, the masks, the cultural scripts. And what he found wasn't soft or sentimental. It was powerful, instinctive, and raw. To Nietzsche, the relationship between men and women wasn't rooted in love or equality. It was built on instinct, power, and survival. And the more you look around today, the more his words feel strangely accurate. This video isn't about blaming men or criticizing women. It's about piercing through the noise and seeing the forces that actually drive attraction, relationships, and control. Nietzsche didn't offer comforting answers. He offered clarity, the kind of clarity that might just change how you see love, identity, and power forever. Let's break it down. Nietzsche believed that most men don't truly love women. They love an idea of women, a projection, a fantasy, one that makes them feel heroic, needed, maybe even superior. It's not real. It's a mask men put on the face of the woman in front of them. He called this romantic idealization a lie, one that says women are delicate, pure, innocent, and emotionally perfect. But Nietzsche didn't think this was flattering. He thought it was cowardly. Because by idealizing women, men avoid facing the complexity of who women really are. They reduce them to symbols of virtue or beauty, so they can stay in control of their emotional world. And when that illusion cracks, when the real woman emerges, bold, strategic, full of contradiction, many men feel betrayed. But she didn't change. The fantasy just couldn't survive the truth. Nietzsche saw that men were not ready to face a woman's true independence, so they disguised their fear as adoration. They called it romance. But it was fear all along. Fear of a woman who doesn't need to be saved. Nietzsche never saw women as weak. In fact, he believed they possessed a different kind of strength, subtle, strategic, and quietly commanding. While men often display their power through status, aggression, or open dominance, Nietzsche argued that women had evolved a more refined method of control, not less powerful, just less obvious. Throughout most of history, women were denied formal power. They couldn't lead armies or rule empires. But instead of surrendering, they adapted. They learned to influence from the shadows through charm, emotional precision, and social intelligence. And while men built their kingdoms with swords and speeches, women shaped the men who built those kingdoms. To Nietzsche, this wasn't manipulation. It was evolution. It was survival intelligence. Women, he believed, developed an almost instinctive sense of how to guide decisions without giving orders, win loyalty without force, and gain protection without begging. Their power was relational. It moved through emotion, not command. And that made it even harder to detect, harder to resist. Have you ever noticed how some people lead without ever seeming to lead? That was the kind of influence Nietzsche attributed to women, not because they were weak, but because they understood the psychology of others deeply, often more than men did. He saw in women a tactical brilliance, one born not of malice, but necessity. Because when you're denied visible power, you learn to master the invisible. And for centuries, society painted women as passive and soft, but Nietzsche saw them as aware, adaptive, and fiercely intuitive. The power was there all along. It just wore a quieter face. In his view, this kind of indirect strength wasn't less noble, it was just less acknowledged. He warned men not to underestimate it, because a woman who truly understands how to shape perception, how to guide through presence rather than pressure, she's not powerless. She's a strategist. Nietzsche believed that women's relationship to power was psychological, symbolic, and often silent. While men saw control as action, women mastered the art of suggestion. Where men demand, women evoke. And in this distinction, Nietzsche saw something profound, perhaps even unsettling. He argued that women had turned the very limitations imposed on them into tools of influence. Morality, grace, delicacy. These weren't weaknesses. They were strategic disguises. A woman who isn't allowed to dominate learns how to guide without appearing to. And in a world where perception is everything, that kind of mastery is more dangerous than brute strength. Nietzsche didn't believe that human beings are driven by truth. He believed we're driven by appearances, by how things seem, not how they are. And in women, he saw this instinct elevated to a form of survival artistry. Not out of vanity, not out of deceit, but out of necessity. In a world where women were judged, sometimes entirely, by how they looked, acted, or spoke, Nietzsche argued they became masters of the symbolic, not because they wanted to be deceptive, but because reality alone wasn't enough to protect them. So they learned to shape perception, to control not what they were, but how they were seen. Think about it. When truth doesn't save you, you learn to use illusion as a shield. Beauty, grace, delicacy, these weren't simply traits, but strategies. In Nietzsche's eyes, they were tools to survive, to influence, and sometimes to win. While men often confused appearance with essence, Nietzsche claimed women knew better. They understood that the mask was not the face, but that sometimes the mask mattered more. Not because it was fake, but because it was functional. Women didn't fall in love with raw truth, nor did they expect men to. They fell in love with symbols, protection, status, strength, not because they were manipulative, but because they had to. For centuries, survival often meant aligning with power, not confronting it. And Nietzsche admired this. He didn't romanticize it, but he respected it. He saw it not as a flaw, but a form of intelligence adapted to a brutal world. Yet he also saw the danger, because when illusion becomes survival, it becomes hard to separate performance from authenticity. Nietzsche feared that love, at its core, had become a battlefield of appearances, a struggle between what we want to believe and what is. And no one fought that war more elegantly than women. To Nietzsche, this wasn't criticism, it was insight, a recognition that femininity, as culture defined it, was largely performative, but not in a superficial way. It was deeply intelligent, strategic, and terrifyingly effective. He saw that in shaping perception, women weren't just navigating reality, they were shaping it. The way they walked, spoke, dressed, smiled. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was communication, influence, power. And yet, Nietzsche was not cruel. He didn't blame women for playing the game. He blamed the world that forced them to play it. He argued that society celebrated the appearance of femininity while punishing its substance. Women were adored when soft, dismissed when strong, praised when passive, feared when assertive. So women adapted, and in doing so, they rewrote the rules of power without ever being given a pen. Nietzsche's view of love was equally radical. He believed it wasn't union. It was war dressed as unity. Men and women, he claimed, were not naturally aligned in love. They were naturally opposed. Men idealized. Women strategized. One chased a fantasy. The other calculated a future. And in that friction, attraction was born. Not despite the conflict, but because of it. Nietzsche lived in a time when women were expected to be silent, obedient, and confined to domestic life. But even then, he sensed the shift. He saw the cracks forming in the illusion. Women were beginning to challenge, to ask, to awaken. And this didn't surprise him. It unsettled him, because Nietzsche believed that the power women had always possessed, subtle, strategic, emotional, would, once unleashed, disrupt the very fabric of society. Not because women were dangerous, but because society was fragile, built on illusions, on roles, on expectations. He foresaw a world where women would no longer depend on male validation, male income, or male protection. A world where women would speak for themselves, define themselves, and lead themselves. And in that world, Nietzsche warned, many men would not evolve. They would resist, not because women were rising, but because the illusion of male superiority was collapsing. He didn't see the independent woman as a villain. He saw her as a force, one that exposed the hollow pride of men who needed to feel needed. Her presence challenged the myth that masculinity was power, that femininity was weakness. She didn't just change the game, she questioned why the game existed in the first place. And Nietzsche knew this would not be a smooth transition. It would be violent, not in weapons but in identity. Men raised to believe they were the center would no longer be necessary, and women who no longer needed to perform to be accepted would stop performing. This wasn't misogyny. It was a warning. He wasn't afraid of strong women. He was afraid of weak men, afraid of what would happen when the old world's lies were no longer enough to keep the illusion going, when comfort gave way to confrontation, when dependency turned to autonomy. Because once a woman no longer needs permission, the system loses control. And Nietzsche believed this loss of control was both irreversible and necessary. But Nietzsche didn't end his philosophy in fear. Beneath all the deconstruction and darkness, there was always a sliver of hope. Hope that something truer could emerge once the illusions died. He imagined a kind of relationship beyond the old games, beyond charm and dominance, beyond projection and resentment. A relationship where neither person plays a role, but stands as a full, flawed, and conscious being. He believed that if men could stop needing to be worshipped, and women could stop needing to manipulate, a new kind of connection could form, not built on fantasy, not built on power, but built on truth. That kind of relationship, Nietzsche said, would be rare, maybe unreachable for most, but for the few who could shed the illusions, who dared to see themselves and each other without the masks, there was potential. Not for peace, but for something better. Mutual transformation.